repeat the non-conformist oath. I promise to be different. I promise to be unique. I promise not to repeat things other people say.
And welcome to another episode of Positive Blatherings with Fitz. And in studio today, I have Keith Greer, who we've been playing phone/email tag for the last month to try to get in here. And each time we wanted to have our little meeting, one of us has had to cancel for whatever reason.
It is good to finally be here.
It's a long time coming.
Yes, it has been.
So one of the reasons why I asked you to come and be my guest was because I was very intrigued by your LinkedIn page and
awesome.
what you do.
Yeah.
I noticed there's a lot of you have a lot of experience in coaching people through recovery, addiction recovery, and things like that.
Yeah.
So, and that's near and dear to my heart.
Okay.
I quit drinking in January, at the end of January.
Oh, mazel tov.
Done. Thank you.
Yeah.
And and then I have a podcast that records here called the 100 Proof Living podcast, and that's all about recovery and that kind of topic.
Oh, I'll have to get that information from you. I'd love to listen to it.
I will do that. Yesterday, the last recording, we had Sheriff Todd Baxter in. He was talking about things. So it's conversations between a cop and a criminal. That's the idea of that podcast.
Yeah.
Two people that normally would not get together and have a conversation.
Have a conversation over a cup of coffee.
Right. And it really just boils down to the fact that we're all human.
Yeah.
And when you get down to the very basic levels, we should be able to have a conversation because we're human.
Of course.
And we share that most important thing in common.
That's right.
So tell me about your background and how you got into this line of work.
Yeah, so I've had the honor, I say, because it really feels that way most days, to do this kind of work in some different environments for 38 years now. So my career started in the treatment world, in the treatment of substance use disorder down in Westchester County, where I grew up, and moved up here in 1983 when I got married. My wife, Carol, is from the area, and had an opportunity in the first few years after I came up here to work for some of the treatment folks here in the Rochester area. So people know it as Unity now. It was Park Ridge Chemical Dependency about 30 some odd years ago. Actually, there was a treatment program, outpatient treatment program at Genesee Hospital when there was a Genesee Hospital.
Yeah.
Worked there. Worked for a place called Westfall Associates, which is still around. And then I had this incredibly unexpected opportunity to interview to be a school social worker. So my education is a master's in social work, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And Webster Schools was one of the first school districts in the area 30 years ago that decided they wanted to have a mental health person on board with a background in working with addiction.
That was 30 years ago.
That was 30 years ago.
That was pretty
it was
ahead
very
of the times.
progressive.
Yeah, very progressive.
Very progressive. And so I interviewed and got the job. And I always like telling the story. I have no memory whatsoever of interviewing. I know I was. I have a very distinct memory of being offered the job and driving home and thinking to myself, I'll do the gig for a year or two, because school social work was not a part of my vision, professional vision at that time. I was going to stay in treatment. I was going to open a private practice. And I thought, all right, I'll give this a try. And what started as a 1 or 2 year experiment ended almost exactly a year ago when I retired after 30 years with Webster Schools. So I did that, and for that time at Webster, I was in some ways a general school social worker, but I was always the guy in whatever building I was in that if there were concerns with any of our kids around substance use, they showed up to school under the influence and possession of, kids coming forward with concerns about maybe some addiction issues at home. That was my conversation. And it ended up being a wonderful place to do this work. Public ed does a lot of things really, really well. I am not among those folks that love to bash public ed. It has a lot on its plate. But in its bones, it wasn't created to do mental health conversations.
Right.
It was created to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Right. Yeah.
And so being that person who led that conversation, which even to this day is still a little foreign for the system, I really enjoyed that. It was at times frustrating. It was challenging. It was incredibly rewarding to be a person in that system that challenged the system to expand its thinking as to why some kids do what they do. There's still, I think, a bit of a narrative in our culture with teenagers that, the good kids don't act out and the bad kids do. The good kids don't do drugs and the bad kids do. And we all know at the end of the day, it's way more complex than that. And I liked being a part of that conversation. So I was there for 30 years. And during the time I was there, shortly after I arrived in Webster, I opened up a private practice, which was a part of my vision. And for the first 15 years or so, it was pretty traditional family therapy. I went back and got a lot of training as a family therapist, most of my work with families that were impacted by addiction. And then somewhere 16, 17 years ago, I started reading about coaching. And there were aspects to what I was reading that just really jazzed me in terms of some of the different ways coaching looks at doing a helping conversation versus a more traditional therapeutic conversation. And went back, got a whole lot of training, and got an advanced certification in coaching, and transformed my clinical practice to a coaching business. And continued to do a lot of work in the area of addiction, although it allowed me to also expand. So today, fast forwarding to today, I spend my time as a coach and a trainer in two different areas. I still do a lot in the treatment and recovery world, both in terms of being a recovery coach and working with folks in recovery, as well as along with my partner, Lori Drescher, being one of the two primary trainers in Central and Western New York for this certification that is now available in New York called a Certified Recovery Peer Advocate. And we can talk a little bit about what that is. And then the other place I spend my time is in the executive coaching world. So that was, once again, a great example of a place I never thought I would wind up. And I had an opportunity about 8 years ago to start doing some work with a area company, a high-tech company in the Rochester area, and loved it, and have continued to work there, both working with individuals, working with groups of their leadership, teaching leadership, some effective communication kinds of things, team building. And so both conversations are incredibly exciting conversations to be a part of. I have found working in the corporate world that there are some similarities to working in schools. Yeah. In that the corporate world was not created to do conversations about wellness. And right. Are their employees doing well, and how are they dealing with things outside? And I just read an article about a week ago that really made a case that the workplace, it now has to be thinking about what are our skills in doing conversations with our employees around mental illness, around addiction, because it's there. And for you could make a variety of reasons why we want to have that conversation. So it has been a very cool career in that I somehow figured out how to stay in the world of maybe what some people would call personal development, but do it wearing some different hats, which has always worked for me because I can tend to get pretty bored if I do one thing.
I can identify with that.
Yeah.
One thing that's really interesting to me is the crossover between the conversation. Well, first of all, let me go back. What is the difference between being a coach and being a therapist, and the things that you do in those two types of work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, I was just having this conversation last night with a prospective client who is considering hiring me as a coach. So the best way I can describe the difference is to start with two very specific aspects of these two helping conversations. And let me back up even a little bit further. This is not about either conversation is better than the other. Mm-hmm. They are two conversations, different conversations with a different idea of what we want the outcome to be. Thus are often for different people at different times in their lives. So when someone calls to hire me as a coach, one of the goals of our first conversation for me is a bit of a professional obligation to determine, is this the conversation you're looking for? Because a lot of times people are looking for therapy.
Yeah.
And this is not therapy. So one of the first ways to think about how to differentiate these two conversations is they have a very different, what I call temporal quality, where in time they take place. In a traditional therapeutic conversation, the conversation often starts in the past, looking at hurts, traumas, things that have gotten in the way of this person functioning at the level they want. It is often in the therapeutic world, beginning of the conversation is often involved in making a diagnosis. Mm-hmm. So are there criteria that this person meets to render a diagnosis, which then allows insurance to get involved and things like that, as well as creating a targeted treatment plan. It starts in the past, and the goal is to move to the present. That at the end of the therapeutic process, today this person is functioning better, happier, in whatever way you want to measure that. Coaching starts today. So we don't spend a whole lot of time in the coaching conversation going into the past. I trust everybody has one. We just don't spend a whole lot of time there. So my conversation with people starts, where are you today? Where would you like to be tomorrow?
Yeah.
And let's get moving.
Yeah.
So there's this temporal quality. Now, the other piece that is a bit different, and again, this comes in lots of different shapes and forms, but very often the therapeutic conversation is one that focuses on process. So we are talking back and forth between therapist and client. We are processing feelings. We are processing thought. Sometimes it focuses on maybe creating an enhanced level of insight for people. Coaching trusts that you have your thoughts and feelings, but coaching is very action-oriented. So when I sit down with a person and they say, here's where I am today, maybe in this very specific area of my life. And so let's say I'm working with someone in early recovery. Here's where my recovery is today. Here's my vision for what it is going to look like tomorrow. We immediately start digging in action steps. So it is a much more action-oriented conversation. Right. I don't want any coaching session to end with 50 minutes of us talking about thoughts and feelings.
Right.
Without it talking about action. All right, client, so between now and the next time we get together, what are you ready and committed to do to move your conversation forward? Those are the two primary differences I see is where in time it takes place and the action-oriented aspect of coaching. The other piece that, and this is the piece that really attracted me to coaching. So I have the opportunity to still do a lot of training in our area for coaches and for clinicians. And there is a bit of a vibe for most of us who are trained as clinicians. And I know it's still there because every time I ask the question when I'm at the front of the room, almost all the hands go up. That inherent in our training to be clinicians and people of change, many of us walked away with a message that we are responsible to create change. We're responsible for the outcome of the change conversation. And I would make the argument that that mindset is probably behind a great deal of burnout.
Yeah.
That I'm somehow supposed to magically be able to change this person in front of me, come up with the answers for them. One of the aspects of coaching that leapt off the page at me as I started reading about it 15, 16 years ago was that coaching has a very different take. So there's this saying that when a coach and a client walk in the room together, the answer is already in the room and the coach doesn't have it. So coaching views their clients as fundamentally brilliant about their own lives, resourceful, creative, artistic, capable. People have their answers, even when they're sitting across from me and saying, Keith, I don't. They've got them. That is a mindset that for me as a coach, I've come to believe with every fiber of my being. Now, the corollary mindset is I don't have anybody's answers. Most days, I can barely keep my you-know-what together as a human being. Never mind thinking that I somehow have this answer that somebody doesn't have, that if I give it to them, everything in their life is going to go well. In 15 years of doing coach conversations with people around a variety of issues, that has never proven wrong, that people have their answers. So this is just my take on coaching according to Keith Greer. Most of us can relatively easily identify that self-critic in our head, right? That voice that goes off, that's the voice of the status quo. Don't stretch out. Don't try something new. All hell's going to break loose. Who are you to think so big about yourself?
Oh, yeah.
Right? We all have that. I don't personally have any idea how to get rid of it. We all have it. What I do believe, though, is that there's a second voice we have, and some would call it the voice of intuition. And our intuition is our inner wisdom, and our intuition is rarely wrong. But there's a problem, and the problem is that for most of us, from childhood through adolescenthood and into adulthood, we lost touch with that voice. We have listened to a variety of other voices in our lives, often very well-meaning voices, loving voices, family, school, other systems we engage in. But that somehow have given many of us in adulthood a message that all of these external voices are more all-knowing than my own internal voice. And so much of what I see myself doing as a coach is I simply sit with people long enough, patient enough, I listen deeply, I ask good questions, I create a place of safety for people to do some exploration. I clearly give this message that, hey, Scott, you have your answers. I trust you have your answers. They're here. They're in the room, even if you don't see them right now. And what I find is that people find them. And any answer that we come up with for ourselves is tremendously more impactful, long-lasting than anything I might share. The last thing I'll say about that, in terms of some ways that I think about this conversation, there's this really cool theory called the theory of psychological reactance. It's been around for about 25 years, very well researched. There is no question about it. And the theory of psychological reactance says that for us human beings, when anybody tells us what to do, the immediate default reaction in our brain is, and I know people can't see this, but...
oh, they can.
Oh, they can, right. Yeah, I'm forgetting that we're on, right? That's the reaction. So we know that's true. Even the evidence would be, even if I ask you for your opinion, if you give it to me, my brain does that. That guides a lot of my work. That if the evidence seems to be that in our brain and the neurology of how we work, if I give somebody a suggestion, there's some little mechanism going on that says, no, I don't want to hear that. Then how about I stop doing that? How about I understand that any suggestion that comes out of me is simply coming from my lived experience, seeing the world through my eyes, which might be wholly irrelevant to you. And that last part, which is the longer I do this work, the more I am no longer surprised that if I sit patient enough, people know. They know what their answers are and how to make them happen. It's just about helping them tune in and trusting that voice of intuition.
That's fascinating. That's real. I've never heard it described that way. I was wondering while you were going through your career, because you were talking about how it's evolved in in the school system and even in the corporate world. How much have you evolved with your job? And then just probably a couple of other questions in there, but we'll start with that one.
Every day, right? So here's a bias of mine, and the field of substance use disorder treatment and recovery, I think, is a really good example. Although I think this is wholly relevant to a lot of the behavioral treatment world. So I mentioned this company I do some executive coaching and training for, and they're a very high-end optics company, like Department of Defense, NASA kind of stuff. Uh-huh. Very successful, known around the world. And every time, in fact, I was just there before I came here, every time I walk into their building, I have this vision in my head that there's some room in this building that every day a bunch of their engineers sit in and they read the research in their field that came out yesterday, figuring out how to implement that research into their production practices today, because that's the only way a company like that stays in business, right? And stays relevant. We have a very long history in the behavioral world of not doing that. So to this day, if you walked in to many, and I'll bring it back to substance use disorder treatment and recovery, many treatment programs, inpatient or outpatient, and you ask people, that modality you're using, why are you doing it and what's the evidence that it works? They often don't have an answer for that. Well, other than because it's just what I've always done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Somewhere, it just struck me in this career the importance of staying up on what the research says. So when my partner and I train these recovery coaches, we talk a lot about this. What we've learned in the last 10 years about the neurology of substance use disorder, about something called the stages of change, when people are really ready to change and how ready they are. What we've learned about the role of ambivalence, which is a normal part of the change process for any human being. I want to, I don't want to, I want to, I don't want to. What we've learned about stigma and the use of language, and instead of some of the historical, traditional language in addiction, like you're an addict and this and that, keeping it person first, medically appropriate, recovery celebratory language, we have learned a ton. Just this theory of psychological reactance, so much that can guide us in how we do a productive conversation. One of the places you're seeing that in the treatment and recovery world is the growing conversation about harm reduction. So, and related to that is the concept of multiple pathways of recovery. So my field has been guided by a very narrow and rigid definition of recovery for 70, 80 years. Some combination of inpatient, outpatient, total abstinence, 12-step adherence. Now, has that pathway worked for many, 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 many people? No question. What we're starting to finally look at is all of the people that pathway didn't work for.
Yeah.
And if you were to poll the 24 million or so folks in our country who would identify as being in recovery, you would see a cross-section of how people have come to find recovery. And one of the places, again, is, does recovery have to even include total abstinence? Or what has really been brought to the fore with the opioid epidemic is harm reduction sometimes just keeps people alive, and can we celebrate that and stop getting caught up in this, you're not in real recovery if you're not totally abstinent.
Right, yeah.
So it's incumbent on us as people who facilitate any kind of change conversation to stay caught up on what the research says. Last summer, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which always does a lot of high-level social science research, they came out with a paper on the current state of adolescent wellness in our country. And
wow.
At the end of the paper, there was a very interesting piece, and what they said is that what they realized is that the world of practice, the world of research, and the world of legislation don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
Right. And part of what they were saying is we really need to. And that hit home for me because especially the world of research and the world of practice, I see that we don't talk. And so I can come into a job and have some initial level of training about how I do this helping conversation, and I can just keep doing it. Even when there's research that would say, hey, maybe you want to try it this way. The other concept you're starting to hear, thankfully, in the treatment and recovery world and in other areas that do any kind of helping conversation is the concept of evidence-based. This modality you're facilitating, show me the evidence. Show me the research that says where it works, who it works with, under what circumstances. Stop just saying, well, I've just always done it this way, because that's just not acceptable anymore.
Yeah. You, when it comes to government and, just the fact that they're not all talking to each other and stuff, your people that work in your field, but that work for government agencies and things like that, they have to be the last ones to be able to get the new Even though they should be the first, but it seems like they're like the last ones to get the new ways of doing things. It always seems like the government is the last one to change.
Right.
It's in the private sector that people start going, hey, check this out. And it's,
Yeah. I don't have a really good answer for that one, other than it just frustrates the crap out of me.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
I had a very interesting experience, I don't know how many months ago, some amount of months ago. There was an op-ed piece in our local newspaper by one of our local legislators coming out absolutely against this concept of supervised injection facilities. So supervised injection facilities are not anywhere in the United States right now. Law doesn't allow it. But they are in a variety of places in Canada and in Europe, and the research around them is pretty astounding with folks with long-term opioid use disorder, in keeping them alive, in attempting to engage them in treatment. The research out there doesn't say that it's causing any more addiction or anything like that. And the legislator who wrote this, there was not one piece of research in his op-ed piece. It was all opinion.
Yeah.
And somewhere in there he used it was some term like, this is going to cause mass addiction, and it was just crazy. So my partner and I do a weekly radio show that covers a lot of issues around recovery, and I did a show one day, and I emailed him, and I very respectfully asked if he would like to come on the show. When I didn't hear back from him, I emailed him again and said I would invite you to listen to the show. So my partner couldn't be with me that day, so I did an entire hour, just me and my voice.
I believe it.
Right? Here's the research, right? Here's what we know about harm reduction, about supervised injection facilities. This is not going to cause mass addiction. This isn't your 17-year-old who's smoking some pot. This is your 30-year-old with a 15-year history of opioid use disorder.
Yeah.
He isn't going to show up just for a treatment program because we say it's a good thing. And so I do this show, and I never heard from him. And about a month or so ago, I was at an event at an area program that does a lot of work in our field, and he was there. Now, he and I have never met face-to-face, but I raised my hand and asked a question, and as soon as he heard my name, he turned around and looked at me. And when the meeting ended, he made a beeline towards me, came up, didn't say hello, and just said, I just really don't agree with anything you said. And he launched into all of his stuff about mass addiction and this and that.
Yeah.
And I just said, sir, all I want to do is have a conversation with you. Could we find a time to have a cup of coffee? I would love to share with you what the research says. Just typical politician. I hate to say that. And that is, those are the people who are making laws.
Right.
And in New York, well, around the country, the hot topic is the whole thing about, do we legalize marijuana or not? And I don't want to get into that, other than that's not as simple a conversation as people want it to be. And yet here are the people making those laws, and they don't know a whole lot. And in this case, I don't even have an issue that they don't know a whole lot. Could you be open to learning some things about what does the latest research tell us? And maybe that goes against what you've always thought, but we need to be guided by what the research world tells us seems to work, doesn't work, and be a part of that conversation of how we integrate that into practice.
And, was it 1492 when some guy said, the world is round, and they said it's flat?
Yeah.
And that's and now there's flat earthers, which blows my mind.
Isn't that? That's pretty amazing.
There's this they cling to these ideas dogmatically, so you cannot bring facts. You cannot show evidence,
right?
Scientific evidence. This is what really happens, not what you've created in your mind or a few,
right?
What's the word I'm looking for? Examples that they've seen for one guy,
right?
Anecdotally started using more or whatever like this. But overall, scientifically done this research, and I'm sure
crazy.
I can only imagine how you who've devoted your life and your career to helping people, to getting to a certain point, and you see that, and it's just got to be like, how do you keep going? How do you do it?
Here's what we know. One of the things that is alive and well is stigma. And the World Health Organization, I can never remember exactly where mental illness and substance use disorder is, but it's in the top 5 of the most stigmatized diseases in the world.
Sure.
And so what is stigma? Stigma is judgment. Stigma allows us to look in and kind of do an us and them. Well, that's not me. That's those people over there. But the other thing stigma does that has struck me over the years is stigma allows me to think simply. Stigma allows me to look at, there is nothing in the world more complex than the disease of substance use disorder. And stigma allows me to look at people who have it and think simply, not challenge me to think about the complexity of how addiction is created, mechanisms at play in our larger culture that support addiction being created. Stigma allows me to look at family members, because in some ways, the stigma that has impacted family members has been even worse than the stigma that has affected people with substance use disorder, because we love to look in at those families and blame parents, and you should do this and you should do that. I say to families all the time, and I would challenge anyone to show me something different, there is nothing more complex in the relational world than loving somebody with every fiber of your being who is struggling with active addiction. Because the symptoms of active addiction often manifest in behaviors that are hurtful to self, hurtful to others, push people away. And stigma allows us to look at people with active addiction and just view them as less than, and it's just those junkies doing it to themselves.
Right.
And we don't have to think broadly, and we don't have to think about neurochemistry, and we don't have to think about all of the different factors, biology, psychology, socially, genetics, all of the factors that go into why somebody might develop this disease of substance use disorder. We don't have to think about that it's not just weakness, that anybody could get out of it if they want. That's, to me, in some ways, even more than the judgment that is inherent in stigma. That's the part that frustrates me, is if we all just took a step back and could appreciate how complex this issue is in our culture today, maybe we would see the people struggling with substance use disorder differently. Maybe there would be better services available. Maybe we would not look at the 72,000 people who died from an opioid overdose last year and not worry about that, because that's those people. And I don't got to worry about those people. It is maddening. And so your question about how do I stay here, my answer to that depends on the day you would ask me.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, overall, many years ago, I read an article about what brings helping people to the helping profession. And this article has always stayed with me because at least for me, it rings true. So the message the author was giving is that those of us who come to the helping profession come for a whole host of incredibly unhealthy reasons. We come to, because think about what we do as helping people. We have made this decision in our lives to sit every day and listen to people's trauma and hurt and sadness and loss, and we get paid about $1.25 an hour to do it, and yet we decide to do it. Now, you could make an argument that's pretty crazy. So what I do believe is most of us come to the helping profession to continue to fix ourselves. So, and I don't have any issue with that. I think that's a lot of, along with being inherently caring, compassionate, empathic people, because I believe that's there too. So what the author was saying is that to stay in the field and to stay relevant and to not burn out, that somewhere as a helping person, his argument was that you need to make a flip from what brought you to the field to what keeps you in the field. And I can definitely own what brought me to the helping profession. You know, if I shared the details of it, you would have complete insight into my family of origin, right? That's what brought me. What keeps me here is that the human condition fascinates me. People fascinate me. The complexity of communication and of facilitating this amazing thing called a helping conversation blows me away. The science behind it. When we train people, I'm very clear. Look, I trust if you're in the room wanting to be trained as a recovery coach, that from your first breath, you are inherently, again, a caring, compassionate, empathic, loving, people-oriented person. I just assume that's in the room. And I'm going to tell you, if you want to do this work professionally, that's not enough. You have to take all of that and you have to meld it with science of what we understand about the change process, about effective communication, about what addiction looks like across the life cycle. That's the part that just blows me away, and I never get tired of reading about it and being curious about it and being curious about how to take some of that information and put it into the helping conversation I facilitate. It's not just that I'm a caring, compassionate dude. That place, in that room with another human being who is often sharing stuff with you that they have never shared with anybody else in their entire life. Some of these facts have never seen the light of day, and yet they're sharing it with you. If that's not a seat of honor for the helping person, I don't know what is.
Very well said. So we're coming up on time. It goes by quickly, as you know. How can people get a hold of you? How can they find you?
There's a few different ways. So the website for my partner Lori Drescher and I is recoverycoachuniversity.com. There's information about us on there. There's information about our trainings. If you are interested in pursuing the Certified Recovery Peer Advocate, which is a really cool, relatively new designation in New York State, very much directed at people in their own recovery, but not solely at that population. Anyone who is interested in developing some good helping skills, things like that, that would be a place. You can find me on Facebook at either Recovery Coach University or Keith Greer. You can find me on LinkedIn at Keith Greer, and my email is keith@recoverycoachuniversity.com.
And your radio show.
And my radio show, yeah, thank you. So that would be a good thing to throw out. So every Thursday morning from 11 to noon, it's Recovery Coach University Radio, and it's always me, sometimes me and Lori, and it's on WAYO-FM, so you can find us at WAYOFM.org, and it's 104.3 FM. And we put together a show. This month is a year anniversary.
Congratulations.
It's been great. I don't know where this came from. I have had in my head since my 20s that I wanted a radio show. I have no idea where the origin of that is.
Me too.
Right? So it's been this really cool exercise. We have a guest almost every week. We focus on multiple pathways of recovery, evidence-based practices, the celebration of the art of recovery coaching. And the other piece that we want is sometimes some of the conversations in the treatment and recovery world can get a little negative, just frustration of what's not there. And we have wanted to keep it real positive. It's a celebration of services that are there. We don't shy away from the conversations about what else needs to be there, but there's some really nice resources in the Rochester area for folks who are struggling with that issue.
That's awesome. I really applaud your work.
Thank you.
And
thanks for having me on. This has been fun.
I'm in the seat of honor today to sit and have this conversation with you. Keith Greer, thank you so much.
Thank you.